Hello everybody, we're working on chapter 7 tonight. There's some very important topics in this chapter. Part of what we're going to be looking at are some more CSS things. There's quite a number of them here. You're going to discover as you're working with HTML5 and the technology of CSS, you're going to discover there's a lot of little nuances with CSS that are kind of difficult to master really in one fell swoop. That's why CSS is one of these skills you're going to keep ramping up as you go. You're always going to pick up new techniques. For all the years that I've been doing it, I still don't think I have it mastered. I mean, I have a really good grasp on it, but they keep adding things to it, adding capabilities. And with HTML5, they added quite a bit of capabilities when they moved it up to CSS3, and I think it's like 3.3 or something like that now. We don't even think about the version numbers with CSS at all, but it does have version numbers. So some of the things we're going to look at here are kind of specific to certain types of tasks. So some of them will focus on a little bit more than others, but I do want to make you aware of all the things in this chapter because frankly they're all important. Okay, one of the first topics in this chapter refers to how we work basically with our file structure. Now you guys have done a little bit of work where you've taken images and you've put them in a separate folder, and then your HTML documents, you'll do something like add a little thing that says like images / the name of the file, right? And that's, a rudimentary form of relative linking. Relative linking basically refers to when you have different files within a folder structure and the path you take to get to that file relative to any other. Now, typically on beginning level HTML authoring, you're going to put most of your files right in the root of your folder, and then you might put images in a folder, you might put some JavaScript in a folder, you might even put some CSS in a folder. And aside from that, you're not really doing a whole lot of like moving around directories. But when you get into more complicated projects where maybe in the root of your website you might only have an index file, just so that when somebody lands there, something happens. And then all your other files might be shuffled off into different folders, in which case you need to be able to navigate from whatever folder you're in, back up and out, and then into the folder that you need. And it can be a little weird if you're not used to that. If you're used to a Linux or Unix file system, Brian, it's probably pretty easy for you to decipher what a .. is. But basically, this is the little tool that you're going to use to kind of like open that doorway. Because what this little indicator shows you, .. means you're going up a folder level and then to the resource. Now, if you're a few folders deep and then you need to go to a resource, you might actually see .. images dolphin.jpg. And it's not unusual, especially when you get to working with content management systems and start working with PHP and some of these other languages. So you'll start to see that. But all the stuff that goes inside of here, if it's within your folder structure, it's relative linking, meaning it's relative to the location of the file you are currently working with. So if I take a CSS file and I put that in a separate folder, and then I have my images in a separate folder, and I need to link from the CSS file to the images, I'm going to have to go up a folder level first and then into the images folder. From the HTML file, I wouldn't have to do that if it's in the root. But you see the little navigation things that you're going to have to worry about. So one of the things that they're showing us here, it says relative links from the home page, index.html. Assuming index.html is in the root folder as shown here, if I want to go to the contact page, well, where's the contact page? It's in the same folder. So you just list the file. If you want to go to canyon.html, well, where the heck is that one? That's in the rooms folder. So here you have to say the folder name first, / and then the file. All right. If you are in the Canyon file, so if you're currently viewing the Canyon page and you want to get back to the home page, notice you have to go up one folder level and then to the index file, because from here you have to navigate up and out and then to the file. That's the ... slash. If you want to take it a step further and you want to go from the Canyon page to the events weekend page, which is also one level deep. So it's one folder deep just like Canyon is. First we go up and out, then we go back in. So this is the up and out, then we declare a folder, and then the file. It will confuse you a little bit at first, and I'll tell you what, sometimes when you're starting to create your own stuff and you start putting stuff in folders, you can confuse yourself. It happens. But if you're not seeing like images show up, if you're not getting to the page the way you thought it was okay, I mean, I just worked on my page, I can see it, right? And then all of a sudden you can't click on it and go to it. This is one of the things you'll look for. And even people that have done this for a long time still make this mistake, so don't feel bad if you make the mistake. So it's not that big a deal, but get to know it. All right. This is kind of an interesting little thing too. So this one's about what they call fragment identifiers. We kind of did this already. Remember at the, like maybe even the first or second night of class, I had you do a link at the bottom of the page and go back to top, right? And little do you know that top is actually one of those that happens automatically. You don't even need to do a div ID top. However, in-page anchors is really kind of what they're talking about here. In the past, we used to write a tag like this. We would write an anchor tag, give it a name, you know, and call it whatever you want to call it. Excuse me. And then you could create a link somewhere else. This would be anywhere else on the page. Well, whatever that says, W-A-E-R-A-W. See, I should type something that's real, probably. Some text, and then you close it, and then when you clicked on that link, it would take you to wherever this spot is. But now what they're telling you that you can do is any element on an HTML page could be at H2, for example. That has an ID will behave in that same fashion. We did talk about this, but I want to match it up with the content in the book. So that's a couple of ways to do that. Yeah, it does have to have the ID. So in other words, any item with an ID is automatically unique on an HTML page. It can only exist once. So linking to it through the use of an anchor tag is very logical. So that's something that got deprecated. The name tag for in-page anchors got deprecated. I didn't even know it got deprecated, but I guess it's deprecated. And they want you to use this approach. So this is good to know. Do you guys remember what this does if I just use a pound sign? It behaves like a link but goes nowhere. Where that's useful is when you're doing a design and you want to be able to hover over a link, you want to be able to click it and see what happens. Well, you know, it's not going to go anywhere, but at least it functions as a link. So that's a helpful little troubleshooting technique. All right, this next little topic's kind of an interesting one. ARIA. The acronym for it, as it indicates there, says Accessible Rich Internet Applications. What does accessible imply? That people with disabilities might have the capability of viewing the content somehow. Okay, so that's a little part of it. But there's also, you know, identifiers, and we call these landmark roles. So prior to us really latching on to HTML5 as a standard, there was a struggle to try to get meaning to pages and point out what something is on a page and what importance it is. And it was a combination for both like specialized screen readers, braille readers, you know, tools like that, but also for mobile devices. So mobile devices, for example, it is very helpful for them to know, for example, that something is a form because it has its own elements built within it that will know how to work with form things. So for example, if I'm working on a regular computer screen, all I have to do is click in there and I can start typing. But when you've got the phone in your hand and you want to put your finger on it and touch it, you gotta make sure you hit it just right. You gotta make sure it's big enough, and in some cases you can programmatically throw things directly into the field so people can start entering in content. It's all on the design, it's all on the designer. But the landmark roles, and you're going to see at the very bottom of the page there how they have a little tag, and notice technically it's an attribute, and the attribute says header role equals banner. So if you think of how we would use a header tag, I mean, that's typically what we do. We put a logo up there, maybe some graphics, a little information, a phone number, something like that at the top of your web page. And the role thing basically identifies to certain types of devices what's going on here. Most notably for mobile. And when you start doing some types of mobile coding, and I think, very specifically towards like tools like what they call jQuery mobile. You guys haven't learned those techniques yet, but basically there are certain languages that read those role tags and do things with them. Not the least of which in some cases is to predefine content styles. There's actually entire libraries of JavaScript that look at these roles and then say, well, since you're using this, we're going to make your form field look just like this. And you might not even recognize it, but sometimes you end up on your device, and I'm holding mine in my hand right now for those that can't see, and you go to a thing, you fill out a contact form, you go, wow, this contact form looks just like the one on this other site. You know why? Because it is. They're using the same things. All they did is maybe put in a tag that with a role, and then it brought up those styles automatically, and there's a whole lot less coding to do for the people that are developing it. So that's one of the things. But these are some of the categories that you can apply to it, and it does help with a lot of those types of coding. All right, here's another fun little technique, and I suppose we should probably bring up an editor and try some of this. But when you go to our course shell, I'm trying to bring up a browser here, and I post videos for you guys, and I know that some of you watch them, some of you don't, and that either way is fine. I must be pushing you guys are going to hear this in every week's video. It seems like, boy, when I do the videos for this class, my machine really crawls to a halt. So I must be either pushing the machine hard or the internet's actually slow. You guys all watching videos in here? No, I mean right now you're watching like YouTube or something. All right, I was starting to get worried there. So you go to like your course shell and you go to the videos and you click on the video link, and what happens when I click the link? Does it open up in the same window? No, it opens up in a different tab. All right. So the point of my example here was, pick any one of our unit folders. And when you click on one of these video links that I have, the way I've set up the links is that they open up in a separate tab. The way that's accomplished, and I'm actually going to close that because it's taking so long to load, is by using this little attribute. So right after you list your href, you can add this target _ blank. And the original purpose of this was to actually open things up in a different browser window, because there was a time that we didn't have tabs in browsers. And you can actually go into the settings for your browser and tell it to open a new window. Over time they got smart and they're like, well, why open a new window? Let's open a new tab, right? And that works pretty well. Now, there's rationales for why to do that, why not to do that. There's for example, in the course shell, why I do that is because if you click on this and the video comes up inside of Blackboard, the navigation isn't always that great. And sometimes it tries to pull the video right into the shell of Blackboard. Not very pretty. So my option is to open up a new tab. And then if you have multiple screens, you could put the video on one screen, you could put the course shell on a different one, just that type of practicality. So if you were wondering how they do that, that's how. There are other attributes you can add there. There's parent, there's self, and I think top. I'm trying to remember all of them. But for all intents and purposes, this is really the only one that's useful. So please keep that in mind. The book probably details all the others, I'm sure. All right. Another thing that I think I talked about very briefly was the fact that, when you create these anchor tags and you create links, the typical habit is to find a word or a phrase or an image and you wrap the anchor tags around it, right? So you have a very specific little spot of linkable text, and you also have a very specific spot for a particular tag sometimes. But you can actually wrap an anchor tag around a whole bunch of tags at once. There's nothing that says you can't. And even people that are experienced, I see, they don't even think about doing that. And frankly, I usually don't either, but I've been seeing it a lot more on websites now, where you go to the site and it's maybe a link to an article. And does it really matter if you click on the title or the body or the image? I mean, it's all going to take you to the same spot. So why not just wrap the link around all of it? All of it's a link. It's kind of an interesting technique. Now, there's some coding things that you might want to do. For example, when text is a link, it turns blue. You might not want that. You might want it to look the same way it does, but you might create a hover effect for it. Remember last week we used the pseudo selectors and we did a:hover, and then you can let people know that it's linkable. And then you can apply that hover effect to H1 and to P, both. That's kind of an interesting thing. Now we're kind of in this modern era now where we've learned that you could do mail to links, remember, so you can send emails right away. But there's also these other ones that really kind of are driven by the mobile world. Uses the same technique. So if you develop something that goes on a mobile phone, you can make that link a telephone number that if people touch it, it brings up the phone. You just add that little tel and the little colon. Same thing for SMS. What's SMS? Text messaging. That's what text messaging is. So if you want to build into your application the ability for somebody to click on something and then bring up their texting application, whatever that happens to be, that's the technique you can employ. Here's another interesting little tool. These are called Sprites. Now, Sprites, and I'm not sure if I showed you this last time. Maybe I did. I did? Yeah, I thought I did. Okay. But basically, Sprites are these little tiny images that may have multiple states for an image. And the thinking is, if I'm using little images that have varying states, for example, I might have a lighthouse and I might have a hover state for a lighthouse, I might have a click state for a lighthouse, I might have a lighthouse that's lit and one that's off, maybe different colors. I can put them all into one document or one image file, and then I can individually pull up little segments of the sprite as I need because the document's already loaded in memory. I'm just shifting positions on that document, bringing up that image. Now, with that being said, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of using sprite sheets, but you should be aware of their existence. Absolutely. They do lend themselves to a couple different benefits, and one of them is what you see here. It saves download time. Because if you have, let's say, 100 different sprites on a sprite sheet, and that whole thing is maybe 20K in size, it might be a whole lot more efficient once it's in memory that you just change positions rather than go to a different page, pull down another document, reload it. There's more code that's being written. It's kind of speed and efficiency. Now, last week we were looking a little bit at layouts, and we looked at some of the code that you might use to create different types of layouts, and that's kind of a continuation here, so you get kind of some of the typical techniques that people are using to do these things. This is not an unusual layout. In fact, I have a team right now out at my SharePoint cohort in Burlington that's working on a website. They're rebuilding a website for Computer Fix-It Place. And what happened is they had a guy that was working on the site, and then the guy broke it, and then he left the job, and they were left with a broken website. But the guy loved the way the website was, and basically it was kind of an old school thing where he had this kind of 3-column approach, a header across the top, and the guy is old school kind of like me, and he loves the nav on the left because that's the way they've always done it, and it works for him, and that's what he wants. So it's not an unusual approach. It's a little bit more old school, but this is a technique that you might think about employing. And notice how everything is placed. There are, some advantages to doing an approach like this. Oops, okay, I didn't mean to jump around so much. If you take a look here at some of the layout, it's kind of, it does lend itself pretty well to a natural visual appeal that kind of mimics in a lot of ways magazine or newspaper kind of layouts. Columns that are narrower are always easier to read, and always kind of keep that in mind. Now, they're giving you here a little bit of a clue as to how they're doing the layout. So notice some of the things that they're applying here to get it to happen. So the left column navigation, they're floating it left. They have to give it a width, otherwise it won't float. So they're giving it a certain size, making it float left so it sits there. The right column, they give that a width also and float it right, so it moves to the other side. Doesn't interfere. The center column, notice what it says, uses the remaining screen room available after the floating columns display. So if my screen's 1,000 pixels wide, this nav area and the aside area will still be 150 and 200 wide. So where this would start to break is if I start to squeeze it down to the point where this is 150 plus 200, that adds up to, 350? So when I get like under 500 pixels, the center section is going to be about that wide. But for a wider screen, it can work just fine. And then notice what they do here with the margin. Yeah, what they're doing is top, right, bottom, left. So they're saying 10 pixels away from the right side, 10 pixels away from the left side, right? Because the left side goes to 150, this one goes to 200. So it's leaving that little buffer. So this would actually work pretty good as long as you have enough screen space to display that main content and it doesn't squeeze down too far. So this is a technique you can use for layout. Yeah, that's exactly what it's doing. Yeah, that's a pretty astute point actually, because if you think about how margin works, remember padding increases the object, margin pushes away. So if you're pushing away to the right, so wherever the edge of your main box is, so from here it's going to push 210 pixels over. It's making sure that the space exists is what it's doing, so it doesn't overlap. All right, so there's a different column layout if you guys want to experiment with it. Another thing that you might want to think about is creating a style sheet for print. Now, that's not something you probably naturally consider when you're working on developing web pages, but I had a project that I was working on many years ago where the client had an e-commerce site. And the e-commerce site had a number of products listed on it, You know, there's little add to cart buttons and descriptions and pictures and all that kind of stuff. But then you get customers that would say, well, can you send me a catalog? Right? And the guy's like, well, I don't have a catalog. So I'm like, well, you know what we can do is we can just take your product pages and I can set up different CSS. And what the CSS would do is it would take the content that's on the page, restructure it so that the header goes away, the navigation goes away, the sidebars go away. It's just the content of the products with the description. Don't need to add the cart button on a catalog, right? So you make some things display none. You make other things display a different way. And then you start switching your fonts from pixels to points because printers like points, not pixels. And then from there, you could actually maybe hit a button that says print this catalog page, and that's basically what we did, and it would just run different CSS, and it's ready for print, and it looks beautiful. And I'm sure you guys have gone to websites too where maybe you've paid a bill or something, and it says print your receipt, right? And really all it does is it brings up a document that's basically been formatted with a different style sheet. Notice the only really significant difference here is that you're describing for media print. Now that doesn't mean it won't come up on the screen, so that you need to understand that distinction too. But when you do go to print, it will be better formatted. Now that takes a little bit of playing with too. I mean, if you've ever worked with like formatting documents, you'll very quickly discover that what looks good on the screen doesn't necessarily look good in print. And it takes a little bit of like prediction and practice and just messing with things a little bit until it works well. All right, so here's some of the things that we were just talking about. In some cases, you might want to hide your navigation. That was a thing that I would do too. So why you don't need navigation on something that's printing? You might need a little bit of information. Use points for font sizes. You need something that has high contrast, so you don't want to have like really, crazy looking backgrounds with strong colors and weird colored text. Think of what a printer typically prints. Black and white is really kind of the preferred format. It's easiest to read. You can also do something that you don't typically do on a web page, is notice that they have CSS styles that are actually designed for print, and this one is page break before. So you can say that I predict that this is where the page break is going to be, so you don't have like part of something on one page and the rest of it on a different page, and it doesn't make sense. You can actually insert, in this case what they're doing is a class that's got a style that basically forces a page break. And if you're not sure what a page break is, that's when you're switching from one page of a printed document to the next. And whether you realize that or not, if you go into Microsoft Word, you can insert page breaks. Because sometimes you don't want that paragraph to scroll to the next page. Or I don't want this section to start until the next page. It's something that takes a little bit of planning. Now, here is something that's really bizarre, and this is the first time we're being shown this. You guys see this little thing here? It says sidebar. So we have something that's got an ID of sidebar, and then we got an A, anchor tag, and then we got a pseudo selector called after. So what they're saying is if you have a sidebar with a link, after that link, we will insert content, and we're adding text to the page. This is really kind of a new CSS thing. When you guys move forward with a lot of the stuff you're learning in this program, and you get to some of the other courses, we delve into these things a little bit more, where with CSS, you can insert content onto your page. It's kind of a weird thought because you think of CSS as controlling style, not content, but it gives us a tool to be able to inject content onto a page in certain situations. So really what they're saying is like if you are on a style sheet for a print document, does it really matter if you're inserting a link? So what is it saying? After we will insert an attribute called href. So we're like injecting. Now this is a very primitive example. It's not really very well formed, but it should give you some ideas. And not only can you insert content, but you can actually programmatically control it. And it's kind of, in some ways, a kind of a revolutionary new thing. You know, CSS has gotten to the point now where you can do so much with it. You can do things that in the past you could only do with JavaScript or other programming languages. Now it's being built into CSS, so you don't have to write code. Well, it's still code, but it's not the same kind of code. It's not standard programming code. All right, everybody uses a mobile phone now, right? Or a lot of you do. And if not, you probably have a tablet. It's a good chance of it. And is there anybody in here that does not have a smartphone? Okay. Anybody in here does not have a tablet? Okay. So it took till 2016 before I didn't get one hand to go up. That's pretty good. Almost 2017. But when you're designing for mobile, it's arguably probably the most important thing you should consider when you're designing these days for web. And that's a significant change from where we were at a number of years ago. Mobiles were an afterthought. It's not that we didn't design for them. It was like, oh, well, if it doesn't look good on a phone, who cares? But now that's the primary surfing mechanism for most people most of the time, even when they're sitting in front of a computer, which is mind-boggling when you stop to think about that. So you have to design for mobile, but notice all these little limitations here that we have to take into account. Small screen, yep, hard to see, but not only hard to see, hard to put your finger on it to touch something, right? Low bandwidth, can't count on that 4G connection. Here in downtown Racine, I get like a rockin' US cellular connection that blows my mind how fast it is. Like I wish I had internet that fast at home, that kind of fast. I've cleared 100 megabits here on campus from US Cellular. Can you believe that? I find that astounding. Drive out past Union Grove, coming from Burlington to here, you know, there's a couple spots, I can tell you exactly where they are, or I can't even get a signal. And if I do get a signal, sometimes it's 1x, so it's like analog. That's like modem speeds. You got to design around that. You got to be kind to your users. Limited fonts, limited colors, different font sets. Colors really shouldn't be too much of an issue on modern smartphones. They should have a full color palette, but sometimes some of the more primitive models will have a limited color palette. So whenever you're designing for mobile, look at the colors on the screen. Bring it up on a mobile device. Don't use an emulator. Bring it up on your iPhone or your Android and see what it looks like. Awkward controls, depends on how big your fingers are, I suppose. Lack of flash. Yeah, flash doesn't exist on mobiles. You can hack it, but it's not really quite the same. And then you have much less computing power. Not to mention that last little bullet there, which is most of us have bandwidth limits. In fact, I say probably all of us have bandwidth limits, right? And it's really easy to chew up that bandwidth. Like if you have, let's say, like a 2 gig or 4 gig or 10 gig limit a month, it doesn't take too many movies before you burn through all that data. So you also have to be kind to your users and not push out so much content that it, both slows them down and chews up their data plan. There are some approaches that you can actually use for making mobile a little bit more friendly. And you're kind of seeing it right now because these are like the web pages you're kind of working on in case studies and how they look on mobile devices. They look much different, don't they? And I think the thing that's most notable is the way the navigation is, the way the text is, and what information is provided. You usually have a more limited set of information on a mobile site. You probably don't fill the page full of ads because you want to get your content in there. It just depends on what you're doing. There are some best practices here, and if you guys want to explore these links, and of course it comes up in my other window, But W3 has a formal document that they consider best practices for working with mobile. And you can go in and you can take a look at some of this. I mean, they get pretty detailed. So if you're wondering, there are resources out there that can guide you. The move these days, and that's what this last bullet is about, is we used to take mobile sites and we'd write them as a standalone website or page, and then we would probably have some JavaScript or a media query or something that would probe the screen size and go, oh, if you're less than 480 pixels, load this other page. And that was a technique. Some people still use it. And I think in many situations that might be a best approach. Depends on the website. But the goal really these days is to design one web page that will work on all devices. And then you leverage CSS in order to make it respond to all those different form factors. That's what we call them, form factors. And adjust. Some things will disappear. Some things will change size. Menus might condense. Text might get bigger on a mobile, believe it or not, because you got to get your finger on it to touch it, right? You got to also be able to read it. And, you know, that takes a little bit of planning. Now, one of the things that you do when you're working with mobile is just, you know, take a look at this layout that they're using. I mean, it's basically the same type of thing, right? Headers at the top, footers at the bottom, you got a nav and a main. They're all in the same order, but it's, you know, narrow. So you got to work with those parameters, and you're going to see we're coming up on some little tips here, and there's actually a bunch of them right here. Single columns is what they recommend. Limit scrolling to one direction. So you don't want, you know, it's okay for somebody to scroll up and down typically, but you don't want them going left and right. It's kind of a pain on a mobile. I mean, most people don't even think that they can, so they don't. All right, use heading elements, use lists, avoid using tables, provide labels for form controls. The reason for labels on form controls is so that we can programmatically identify a form field. One thing that we haven't really done yet is forms, have we? Okay. Well, we'll talk about that. But, you know, when you're putting a form field out there, like a little box where you type text, it's a good idea to put something in front of it that says what it is. But you can do it a couple different ways. You can just put some text in there, or you can put a label tag on it, and the label tag helps to marry it to the form field and helps to describe it. So it's just a best practice. It says, this is kind of an interesting one. It says avoid using pixel units in style sheets, which kind of goes contrary to a lot of what I practice and preach. So I'm just going to what I'm telling you here is that they're telling you to avoid it, but I'm telling you that there's kind of like a flip side to that, kind of a practicality thing. Yes, you can avoid it provided you set up your style sheets the right way. By the right way, I mean that you set base level information that you can go relative to. You don't want to base it on the browser defaults because users can change those. That's really kind of the point of that. Avoid absolute positioning. That's generally true in just about every type of web page design, although it can work. Absolute positioning that might work on a regular web page might completely break a mobile site, so you want to skip that. And you can hide stuff. Navigation, of course, is a big issue too. I always tell people I got big fat fingers. If my finger can't fit on it, I'm not going to click on it, right? You know, like you get ads that pop up. I'm not sure what that sound was. Let's find out. All right, whatever you do with your navigation, though, you want to make it so that it's pretty intuitive and easy to find. The typical pattern is that you do something like this, or very often you see those little condensed menus where it's like 3 little lines and blocks, and you know how to click on it, and the menu pops up. So there's different approaches there. Don't put too many links on a page. Don't make the navigation too complex because you do have a limited number of screen space to work with. You will want to also reconsider how you do your images on a mobile device. Loading excessively large images even on a desktop is not really recommended. You go to a mobile device, you got a really tiny screen, it becomes even more important to effectively use that space. So follow those tips. Contrast is probably as important for mobile as it is putting stuff up on this big screen here in the classroom. Have you ever seen somebody do a PowerPoint? Looks great on their screen, you put it up on the big screen and it looks like heck. And the reason is because things that look good on a small screen where you have the full color resolution, you have the full brightness of the screen and the contrast, things will look good. Projectors, no matter how good the projector is, I've seen very few that look as good as the standard display. So that is an important thing too. Look at some of the other things they're pointing out here. Use common font typefaces. Font size with M units or percentages, and I always qualify that as long as you have a good base font size to work with, because with mobiles you're much more apt to scale things dynamically, and things scale dynamically better if you use M's and percentages, given that you have a relative starting point. All right, another little thing that we're going to look at here, and we're going to do this slide and then we're going to take a break and come back, is a thing we call the Viewport Meta Tag. Now, you have learned one meta tag so far, and that's the one where we declare the character set to UTF-8 that you should have hypothetically in every HTML5 document. But the Viewport Meta Tag has a special purpose, and notice really what it does here. It says it sets the device width's initial scale to 1.0. Now what that means is that when somebody lands on your page, they will not come in zoomed in. That they'll come in at 100% size. That might be very important to what your site does, because you don't want somebody to land on a page and then have like super zoomed in or super zoomed out or God knows what. So this is just a way to control that. It's considered good practice, especially if you expect your site to end up on a mobile device. The viewport basically refers to the device you're seeing it through. That's what it represents. It did originally extend out of Apple devices. It's always considered really good practice if you know your audience is, Apple people. But really, it's a good idea for all mobile development and really all website development. I will tell you, I'm not in the habit of putting it in on my stuff, but if I'm using some sort of an engine that automatically drops it in, I leave it there. But if I know that it's going to mobile as a primary platform, I make sure it's there. All right, folks, let's take a break. We'll come back and finish up. All right, now that we're back from our break, we're going to look at one of the cooler features of CSS3. And that is this thing called media queries. Media queries are really kind of one of the most important developments in terms of making our websites able to create, or making us able to create, one single web page that can respond to all the different form factors that we have. And basically what a media query does is it figures out your screen size currently, and that does not necessarily mean my whole monitor, but really means the size of the browser window. So if I'm looking at a page, let's say I'm looking at this page, and right now my browser's full width, but as soon as I bring it out of full width, what size are we at? Well, we're not entirely sure, but as I get narrower and narrower, you can see after a while Blackboard CSS kind of gives up, right? That's really because it's not designed for mobile. That's where they say get the app, right? That's what a lot of websites do. But as soon as that starts changing sizes, media queries will recognize the threshold that you've crossed, and then based upon that threshold, set a different CSS style. So, I mean, that's the long and the short of it overall. But there's, obviously a little bit of stuff that you have to know in terms of doing that. So a very simple little approach is something like this. So you have a style sheet, and then notice here for the media tag, it actually looks for a max device width of 480 pixels. Now this media query is designed to actually take you to a different style sheet. So as soon as we cross that threshold, then we load this other file. Now that's okay if you're landing on the page. But what if you're already on the page? So you see, like when I was adjusting the screen size, how it changed dynamically. If you were actually to do it within your CSS file, where this is really the better approach, you would actually set up a little code block. Notice the @ sign. So the directive is basically @media. Then we look for that width again. And then everything that's inside this set of curly brackets can be a completely independent set of CSS. Now, if you write any styles within here, so let's say I change my paragraph font from 12 pixels to 20 pixels, something like that. That's the only style that's going to be changed. All the rest is still going to maintain. So it overrides the directives that you have. So you might change some things in size, you might actually make things disappear, you might change colors, you might hide images, you might show images. You know, there's all these little tweaks. I mean, there's so much that's possible, it's kind of mind-boggling, really. And one of the ways that you can really appreciate seeing something like this is to look at a website that uses them. And I'm hoping that when we get done with this chapter here in class, I can demonstrate that to you. Another thing that you can do is do something kind of clever, and that is take an image that you already have existing. Like notice the little header background image that they have here. And notice what they're doing. They're applying to the image tag a thing that says max width 100%. Well, 100% of whatever is containing it, right? So it might be the page, it could be a paragraph, it could be the div, and then height is automatic. Now height is automatic anyhow, but if you want the image to scale, it's strongly recommended that you put both of these in, and that way, regardless of the screen height, it will automatically reduce that image to that same size regardless of the screen width. So it'll always be the full width of the header. That's the way it's set up here. That image is that way. Notice it's not the text. That's handled separately. But that's a really cool technique to employ because it's kind of nice to have one image that just gets bigger or smaller as you need it. Looks pretty slick. It always fits. No awkward points from going from one size to another. It just automatically scales down. Now, when we're using media queries, take a look at the difference here. And I'm going to correct myself. This is not a media query. But what we are seeing here is a brand new HTML5 tag. Now, even though HTML5 is a standard, this tag has been in development for a couple of years now. And I've had students use it in the past because they researched it. But it's not really taught very much, because hardly anybody uses it. But it's a cool tag because what it does is it kind of handles some of those media queries for you. And notice it's a new type of tag. It's called picture. Who would have thunk it, right? That we call an image a picture. But what it does is it kind of has those media queries built in. And you can see this technique that we're going to employ here is a similar technique as when we use multimedia. So basically we provide a number of different formats. The media tag, the media attribute actually, will dynamically look at the screen width. And then depending on that threshold that you set will load a different picture. That's pretty cool. And this is without going into the CSS and doing a media query. Now you could do it there as well. That's another approach. But what this does is it actually loads a different image, which from the terms of making your page more efficient for download, this is really a better technique, right? Because if you're downloading a large image and you're squeezing it down to fit on a phone, it's still a large image. You're still moving that data. This overcomes that technique by just very simply loading a different image in its place. Notice also at the very bottom that they have a fallback image. So what a fallback image is, if none of these are able to load, for whatever reason, it will automatically just use a regular image tag and pull in the image, some image. Maybe it's the medium-sized one, I don't know. But it'll pull in some image for you. This is a new technique. It's a very cool technique, and you're going to see it a lot more. You guys are, just getting into coding at this point, so you're kind of at the dawn of this tag. So when you get to my age and you're like teaching this stuff, I remember when the picture tag was brand new. And it's not really all that new. It's just that finally getting into the textbooks and getting into usage. All right, so another approach for doing the same thing, it basically is taking this picture tag and applying a different approach. So notice, once again, you're using an image tag, but the source for it is the fallback image right off the bat. You are also declaring a set of sizes that you can use, and then depending on the size, it's kind of just really an abbreviated form of what we just saw. There's been a little bit of competition between the two formats as which approach is better. I think the jury's still out on it. We'll see which one pans out. The picture approach has been around. This one's been around a little bit longer, and this is one that they're pushing now because people are used to working with images. So in this case, you can just basically add a couple of attributes, and that's sizes and the source set. You can declare the screen widths, and then it'll automatically load the different images. All right, you're designing stuff for mobile. Hands down, best way to test it is use a mobile device. It's really the only reliable form. However, there are emulators. There's pieces of software you can download that will emulate mobile devices. Your browsers, these days all have emulators built in. So just for example, and in fact I'm just going to do a right click inspect, and you see this little icon right here, right down here. If you click on that, it will load an emulator. Supposedly this is an iPad. You can choose your different devices, and I think I showed you some of this stuff already. Some of the tools out there will have a significantly larger set of phones that you can choose from and devices that you can choose from. And I'm trying to get my browser to cooperate with me, but Chrome is being very weird tonight again. There we go. There we go. Now you can pick all your little devices. So not a very extensive list, but you notice you can turn some on and off. And then if you know what the devices are, what the specs are on it, you can feed the specs in manually. There's also these different components here you can play with. And basically what some of these are throttling profiles. What's throttling? Yeah, you're slowing down the connection, because guess what? Mobile devices often don't have the same bandwidth available. And you see the options here where the device is offline, or the different types of mobile speeds that are available. What's it going to look like on Wi-Fi? What's it going to look like on DSL or 4G, etc. So these are tools that are just built into the browsers. All the browsers have these tools now, at least the main three, and now it's Chrome, Firefox, and Edge, And we can't forget Safari. Safari's got it too, although I don't think their tool set's really quite as nice, but you should be aware. All right, another real modern technique, and I'm going to tell you, when I show this to students, and I know you guys have exercises that employ this, very quickly people that are new to coding jump right to this because it works so well. It really makes a lot of this stuff easier. And Flexbox is the thing that's been around for a little bit. It is something that you apply inside of your CSS. So when you have an element and you call it a Flexbox, basically it allows you to do a couple of things automatically. All right, so it says elements contained within a Flex container can be configured either horizontally or vertically in a flexible manner with flexible sizing. So you don't have to worry so much about the media queries. You just basically declare it as Flex, and for the most part it works. Now, you can control a few different things. Notice they have which, if it displays or not, which direction is it flexing, horizontal or vertical. Are we going to wrap the contents, justify the contents, etc. And then you have this little website here, and I think I've showed it to you at least, website called Can I Use? And I don't know if you guys have been to this website yet, but basically what Can I Use does is you type in any CSS or HTML tags or attributes or whatever, and it'll tell you which browsers support it. Now you can see that Flexbox now is well supported by all the browsers. They don't show the old Internet Explorer ones, so I'm not sure why, but let me just type in Flexbox and see if it gives me a different result set. Now it gives the same result set, and I'm really curious as to, I mean, normally they would show the old browsers here, but apparently they're just ignoring that. But at this point in time, it looks that Flexbox works pretty universally. Whenever you're looking at this Can I Use website, always check these known issues. You know, so they're showing you, of course, it's all Internet Explorer stuff. And really at this point, you know, you probably want to be careful with it. All right, this is interesting. Firefox has, when it says Firefox does not support Flexbox in button elements, so you don't want to use a Flexbox inside of a button. Got that? I can't think of why you would, but somebody must have tried it. So that's a cool website. You know, you guys are kind of fortunate, really, because it wasn't too long ago that a lot of this new CSS stuff was very, very particular and didn't work in a lot of different browsers. So you had to do a lot of research, study, and experimentation to see what would work. But apparently now it seems completely safe. So I say go for it. How do you use a Flexbox? Here's an example. All right, take a look. They have an ID, or an object with an ID of demo, and then notice that they're throwing in this little WebKit thing. What is? You guys remember what that is?
It's calling it to the play. Well, it's page to hit the phone to the left browser, for the left editor.
Okay. And which browser is a WebKit browser?
Chrome.
Chrome and Safari.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So those two browsers, they're indicating here that if you're using one of those browsers, you should probably put that in. My intuition tells me that from what we just saw on the Can I Use website, you probably don't need that. But the point is that they're setting it up so that WebKit browsers can do the same thing. And when you're really doing like browser extensions like this, you might want to include the MS and the O and the MOZ, all those prefixes that we had talked about before. Okay, so we're setting up so that it can display flex, and then we can do flex direction, and it's, okay, I didn't mean to do that. And here it's saying in a row. So what that's going to do is it's going to flex across, because a row goes across, so you think of like a table. There's columns and rows. Rows go across. So it's going to flex basically in the horizontal direction. So depending on how you lay out your page, you can control what flexes and how. In this example, they put things in, and notice that they actually have proportion adjustments. So things will get different values depending on what they are. And I know that there's an exercise that you guys will do in your case study that kind of guides you through doing that. And I'll tell you what, when you play with that and you actually manipulate the code, I guarantee some of you are going to use that as a preferred approach because it's pretty easy to employ. All right, so that's one of those techniques. That pretty much wraps up the chapter. I do want to remind you, as the author does here, that there is a CSS validator. If you are using, one of the better coding tools, at least the ones that color code, at least you can see when the stuff is broken. But it's not a bad idea to validate with this tool. It's not really considered a necessity, but when your CSS breaks, your whole site can break. So it's not a bad idea. So their debugging tips: manually check. You guys probably try to do that. Use a validator. Configure temporary background colors. So if you're trying to figure out a problem, that's not a bad approach. Temporary borders are also good. So why would you do temporary backgrounds and borders? Very simple. Bingo. It shows you where something is on the page. It shows you the parameters of where the thing is on the page. Because typically when you have a paragraph, you don't think about it having a size and a shape because you don't usually see the edges of the content of the box it's filling. So if you put a background on it or you put a border around it, it shows you exactly where it sits. So that's, I think, kind of handy. The other thing that you should do is use comments. Whenever I do changes in CSS files, and I don't know if I have any open in Notepad++ right now, there's a chant. Well, okay, I got this one here. But you can see even right here, this example, because we were playing with this with a student here in class, is some stuff that I tried and I just commented it out. Get into that habit, Another technique that I might use is, for example, if I made a change in this spot, I might take the original code and just copy it into a comment like this, and then I would go and change it, and then if I really mess it up, I can go back because I have it right there. Or if I write a new style, I don't delete the old one, I'll leave it in place. And really, that's something you should do with your code too. And then if you really want to clean it up for when it goes out to the world, you can do that. But there's plenty of times that I even leave those edits in there. And I'll do markers. Like right now we're working with a file that's 30 lines long. I've seen CSS files that are thousands of lines long. And then all of a sudden you're making an edit and you want to try to find your spot. Well, one of the techniques I'll employ is I'll put in a comment and I'll just go TK edit, my initials, right? And then when I'm trying to find that spot in the document again, I just do a find and look for TK edit and it comes up. So it's just, little techniques like that. So verbose edits or verbose comments aren't a bad idea either. And this is a summary of what we learned, and that ends this video.